At 8:15 in the morning on August 6, 1945, a 29-year-old engineer was walking down a street in Hiroshima when the sky turned white. The shockwave hit before he could understand what he was seeing. It knocked him off his feet and threw him into a field. His eardrums ruptured. The skin on his left arm was burned in an instant. When he lost consciousness, the city around him was already gone. His name was Tsutomu Yamaguchi. He was 2.6 miles from the hypocenter of the world's first combat nuclear detonation, and he was alive. 3 days later, he would be back at his desk in his home city of Nagasaki when history did something that has no precedent and has had none since. It happened again. Yamaguchi was born in Nagasaki in 1916. He worked as a draftsman and naval engineer for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, which maintained facilities in both Nagasaki and Hiroshima. In the summer of 1945, he was nearing the end of a 3-month work assignment in Hiroshima. He had a wife, Hisako, and a young son waiting for him at home. He was not a soldier. The war was context in daily pressure, as it was for millions of Japanese civilians. On the morning of August 6th, he was walking toward the Mitsubishi shipyard office when he realized he'd forgotten his worker's pass. He turned back to collect it. A small, ordinary mistake. It delayed him just long enough to place him in a particular street at a particular moment, outdoors and exposed when the bomb the Americans called Little Boy detonated at approximately 1,900 feet above the city center. The fireball formed in a fraction of a second. Buildings within a mile of the hypocenter were destroyed instantly. The cloud that rose above Hiroshima reached 30,000 feet. Approximately 80,000 people were killed in the first moments. Tens of thousands more would die in the weeks and months that followed. Within seconds, much of Hiroshima's central district ceased to exist as a functioning city. Streets that had been filled with people minutes earlier were suddenly covered in debris, fire, and silence. Yamaguchi was far enough from the center to survive, not far enough to be unharmed. When he came back to consciousness, the city around him had become something he could not immediately recognize. A mushroom-shaped cloud above, buildings destroyed, fires spreading in every direction, people moving through the streets in states of severe injury, many of them in silence. He found 2 colleagues from Mitsubishi who had also survived. Together, the 3 men moved through the destruction, located an air raid shelter, and spent the night of August 6th inside it. The following day, they made their way to the train station. Some lines were still partially functioning. Yamaguchi's upper body had been burned by the thermal radiation. His hearing was gone. He wrapped his wounds in whatever could be found and kept moving. By August 8th, he was on a train heading southwest. He was going home. He arrived in Nagasaki on the evening of August 8th. His wife and son were there. He was bandaged, burned, his left arm damaged. A man returning from a city that had ceased to exist in the form it had taken for generations. He told his wife what had happened. She treated his wounds as best she could. The following morning, August 9th, Yamaguchi reported to work at the Mitsubishi office in Nagasaki. He was called in to speak with a supervisor who had heard the reports coming out of Hiroshima. A single bomb, an entire city destroyed, and was skeptical. Yamaguchi was in the middle of describing what he had witnessed, trying to put into language an event that language was not built to hold, when the room went white. It was 11:02 in the morning. At 11:02 on August 9th, 1945, the second atomic bomb detonated above Nagasaki. The bomb the Americans called Fat Man used plutonium rather than uranium. It exploded at approximately 1,650 feet above the city. Its yield was larger than the Hiroshima weapon. Hills surrounding Nagasaki contained some of the blast in ways that altered the pattern of destruction, but it still killed approximately 40,000 people immediately. Total deaths by the end of 1945 would reach between 60,000 and 80,000. The Mitsubishi office where Yamaguchi was standing was approximately 2.5 miles from the hypocenter. nearly the same distance he had been standing from the center in Hiroshima 3 days before. The glass blew inward. Yamaguchi hit the floor. He survived once more. What that moment was like, the recognition, mid-sentence, that what was happening was the same thing that had already happened to him once, is something his later accounts touched on but could not fully capture. He described the flash. He described the destruction. He spoke about it over the following decades with the careful, measured language of a man who had long understood that what happened to him was not something ordinary words could hold. He is, as far as documented history records, the only person to be present in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki when the atomic bombs fell, survive both explosions, and have that fact officially recognized. Japan's government formally acknowledged his status as a survivor of both bombings in 2009 when he was 93 years old. Others were also in both cities. Estimates suggest several dozen people may have experienced both bombings and survived, though the precise number remains unknown. The record-keeping of a destroyed nation in the immediate aftermath of 2 nuclear detonations was inevitably incomplete. But Yamaguchi is the one the historical record holds clearly and continuously, from that street in Hiroshima to that office in Nagasaki, and through every decade that followed. His wife and son survived the Nagasaki bombing. They had been in a neighborhood away from the blast path. The family was intact. The city around them was not. In the years that followed, Yamaguchi lived with the physical consequences of what he had survived. Radiation sickness manifested after both bombings. He recovered. He returned to work, eventually became a teacher, and watched Nagasaki rebuild itself from inside the city where he had survived the unsurvivable twice. For many years he did not speak publicly. The history of hibakusha, the Japanese term for atomic bomb survivors, includes many people who carried the experience in silence for decades, for reasons that included social stigma and the simple difficulty of describing something for which no adequate language existed. Yamaguchi eventually chose to speak. In his later years, he became an advocate for nuclear disarmament. He gave interviews and contributed his testimony to the historical record, not as performance, but as the deliberate act of a person who had been present at something the world needed to understand. Tsutomu Yamaguchi died on January 4, 2010, in Nagasaki. He was 93 years old. He had outlived both bombings by 64 years. He had outlived his wife, Hisako, who died in 2008. He lived long enough to see Japan and the United States become allies, to see Hiroshima and Nagasaki rebuilt, to see a world continue in ways that the morning of August 6, 1945, had made seem genuinely uncertain. He was not a symbol. He was a person. An engineer from Nagasaki who had forgotten his worker's past, turned back to collect it, and found himself at the center of 2 moments that have no equal in the history of warfare. The 2 atomic bombings remain the only uses of nuclear weapons in war. To survive one was something no probability table anticipated. To survive both, the historical record contains one name for that. He survived. He bore witness. He told people what he had seen until the end of his life. That is not a small thing to do with an experience that no one should have to carry. If stories like this one, history held inside a single human life, are the kind that stay with you, consider subscribing. These are the stories worth telling carefully. Leave your thoughts in the comments below.